So welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome to our lecture series called Daily News in Shorts. In this lecture series, we cover a particular day's current affairs in a short span of time within 30 minutes so that your entire day is freed up to cover other parts of your UPSC syllabus. The only aim is to cover all your current affairs for the day in a short span of time. Now, just watching this lecture would be job half done. Just after spending 30 minutes watching this lecture, you have to revise this lecture as well, because revision is very important if you really want to retain these current affairs in your memory. Otherwise, you'll quickly forget them. Now, revision would take around 20 minutes, not more than that. And you can revise these current affairs from the notes provided by us. Now, these notes shall be shared on our Telegram channel. And where can you find our Telegram channel? Well, just below this video in the comments section, you'll find a link. Just click on that link, it will take you to our Telegram channel, and from there you can download the notes for this lecture and spend the necessary 20 minutes revising this lecture. Alright, so you have to follow this regimen. 30 minutes of watching this lecture, 20 minutes of revising this lecture, and in about 50 minutes time, you'll be done for the day. Alright, now you can spend your entire day as you want. Alright. Enough of the introduction, let's straight away jump into the discussion. But first, let's take a look at the topics we are going to discuss in today's lecture. Okay, here's a list of topics, today's topics. Okay, so number one is India-Sri Lanka engagement. Okay, recently India and Sri Lanka, basically Sri Lankan president came to India and an agreement was signed between India and Sri Lanka. So we'll talk about this issue. All right. Then we'll talk about how global crises are connected. Okay. Recently, a report came out, and that report from an international organization says that global crises like biodiversity loss, environment, hunger, poverty, they are all interconnected. Therefore, a strategy should be formed that looks at these issues on a holistic basis. Okay. You should have, there is no way out without fighting these issues together. Okay, you cannot focus on them individually. So we'll talk about this issue also, which is related to environment. Then Bangladesh Prime Minister and Pakistan Prime Minister met on the sidelines of D8 summit in Cairo, Egypt. Now, they talked about mending the issues between Pakistan and Bangladesh, and Pakistan and Bangladesh should come closer. But they also talked about D8 summit. So what is this D8 summit? We'll talk about this. And in the end, we'll talk about RBI's report on state finances. So recently, RBI came out with a report which talked about the financial position of state governments, not central government, state government. Okay, so these are the four issues that we are going to focus on. So please pay close attention, give me your 100%, and let's start. Okay, so first topic is India-Sri Lanka engagement. So recently, Sri Lanka's president, newly elected president Anura Kumara Dissanayaka, very popularly known as AKD, okay, he came to India and this was his first foreign trip, and he decided to come to India for his first foreign trip. Now, both sides actually made some deals on the sidelines of their mutual bilateral summit. Okay, there was a lot of give and take. India extracted some concessions out of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka extracted some concessions out of India. Now, after their meeting, both sides came out with a joint statement. Okay, and the title of that joint statement was Fostering Partnerships for a Shared Future. Now, what were the key takeaways in this joint statement? Okay, very important. So, what were the key takeaways? So, first of all, India was really worried that Sri Lanka would go closer to China. Plus, this new president, AKD, has a communist past. He was a Marxist way back in his political career. Now, people thought that he would be closer to China, and India was worried that AKD would take Sri Lanka closer to China and away from India. But in this meeting, Sri Lanka has made it clear that it won't allow its territory to be used in any manner that is bad for India's security interests and regional stability. So it won't allow Sri Lankan territory to be used for things that would be inimical to India's security interest. This was a clear signal to China, because Chinese research vessels, okay, now research vessels or warships, have patrolled in Indian Ocean and have docked in Sri Lankan coast at Sri Lankan coast. Now, earlier, Sri Lanka allowed China to dock its research vessels into its territory, but now Sri Lanka has made it clear that it won't do so. So, it is a clear message to India that we won't allow our territory to be used by China for things that would be bad for India. So, this is a big win for India. Okay. Another thing that India wanted was not given by AKD. So India wanted that Sri Lankan territory shouldn't be used by China. Okay, that was given. But there was this another thing that India wanted, but that was not provided by Sri Lanka. And that was that India is really worried about the political future of Tamils in Sri Lanka. Okay, now look, the majority community in Sri Lanka is Sinhalese. Okay, but Tamils are in minority in Sri Lanka, and they are mostly concentrated in the northern and eastern portion of Sri Lanka. Now, way back in 1987, Sri Lanka passed 13th Amendment to its constitution, which provided some political powers to the provinces in the north and east. Basically, more political powers were devolved to northern and eastern regions which have Tamils. Okay? Now, this 13th Amendment was passed in 1987, but it hasn't been amended still. Now, India wants that AKD or Sri Lanka implement this 13th Amendment. But AKD has not given any promise. In fact, during his election campaign, he said that he's against 13th Amendment, which is bad for India and Tamils. Okay. Plus, the civil war between Sinhalese and Tamils that took place in the 90s. Well, there were allegations that Sri Lankan army committed war crimes against Tamil rebels. Now, there should be an investigation against those war crimes, but AKD says that there won't be any investigation. So, as far as the Tamil question is concerned, well, Sri Lanka did not give any concession to India. But as far as the China question is concerned, well, Sri Lanka is all with India. All right. But that's not the only thing. Along with this, both countries talked about various developmental cooperation also in their joint statement. First of all, Sri Lanka acknowledged that India has been a great developmental partner. It has given developmental aid to Sri Lanka for its development. So Sri Lanka acknowledged that. Along with that, Sri Lanka said that we would want India to fast track and complete the ongoing infrastructure projects that India is constructing in Sri Lanka. Okay, so timely completion of ongoing projects like phase 3, phase 4 of Indian housing project in Sri Lanka, Three Islands hybrid renewable energy project, high impact community development projects in Sri Lanka. So India was constructing these projects. Now Sri Lanka wants that they should construct these projects quickly. Plus, both sides are cooperating in the field of energy also. India is going to supply LNG to Sri Lanka. There is going to be a development of regional energy and industrial hub in Trikonamali. Okay, high capacity power grid interconnection and development of offshore wind power in Park Strait. Then physical connectivity infrastructure projects are also being talked about. Plus, the two leaders also talked about a defense cooperation agreement between the two sides so that Sri Lanka is closer to India and more away from China. China threat looms large, and India is really worried that a regime that is more friendly to China shouldn't come into power in Sri Lanka because that would really jeopardize India's security interests. All right. So this is something that you need to know about India-Sri Lanka relations. All right. Okay. Now let's move on to our second news item, which is how global crises are connected. Now, what is this report? Basically, look, you must have heard about a scientific body called IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is the most significant scientific body which provides scientific information related to climate change, and it really informs policymakers during the climate summit, okay, to take action. Now, there is a similar body which is similar to IPCC. It is called IPBES, and it really provides scientific data on biodiversity. All right. So, if there is a scientific panel, global scientific panel on climate change, there is a global scientific panel on biodiversity. All right. And this IPBES has come out with a report. Okay. Now, in its report, it says that there are five major challenges that the world is facing right now. Climate change is one of them, biodiversity is one of them, food insecurity, water scarcity, and health risks. These are the five major challenges facing mankind, right? Now, this report says that all these five challenges are interconnected. If you try to solve one, then you also should solve the other because they are interconnected. You cannot completely focus on one and ignore the others because the others would have an impact on one. So, all of these five challenges should be tackled together simultaneously. All right. This is what is being argued by IPBES in its report. Now, first question that arises is, what is IPBES? Okay. So, like IPCC, which is a scientific intergovernmental international scientific panel for climate change, IPBES is Intergovernmental Scientific Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystems. Okay, it was set up in 2012 and it periodically examines all the existing scientific knowledge on biodiversity and nature to make an assessment of their current state, and then it informs various summits related to biodiversity like CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, okay, and many other summits that are focused on biodiversity. Okay, they need scientific information. That scientific information is provided by IPBES. IPBES produced its first report in 2019, in which it assessed the threat to global biodiversity. And it is on the basis of this report of 2019 that in the next Convention on Biodiversity, okay, Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was enacted. So Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, it was enacted in 2022 and it was based on the information provided by IPBES in its report in 2019. Okay. Now this Kunming Montreal Framework is very important because it gave 23 targets to be achieved by 2030 to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Okay. In fact, in this framework, uh, 30-30 targets were given. Now, what is this 30-30 target? Well, 30% of the ecosystems should be saved and 30% of the destroyed ecosystems should be restored. And all of this should be achieved by 2030. That is why it was called 30-30 targets. These 30-30 targets were part of these 23 targets enacted under Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And this Kunming framework is based on the report of IPBES. So IPBES is a very important body that provides scientific information to international organizations to take action on biodiversity. Because biodiversity and ecosystem provides a lot of services. Okay, they provide cultural services, supporting services, regulation services, provisioning. You are given water, food, everything is based on the environment. All right. Now, this report by IPBES is called the Nexus report. And okay, so the name is Nexus report. And one of the biggest contribution made by this Nexus report was that it tried to make a connection between economy and biodiversity. You see, generally people are not that much focused on biodiversity because they're not worried about biodiversity. They think that it won't really harm them. But biodiversity has a significant impact on economy. Okay? The entire world's GDP is $58 trillion. Okay? And all of that is highly dependent on nature. But the world is seeing 2 to 6% of biodiversity loss every decade. Now, if this continues to be the case, this $58 trillion worth of GDP will decline significantly. So, you need to protect biodiversity because it really harms your house budget. It really harms your incomes. So, this is an important connection to make because people understand the language of money. That is a very famous saying. People only understand the language of money. So the only way to motivate them to take care of biodiversity is to make a connection between biodiversity laws and economic laws. And that is what this Nexus report tries to do. All right. Just remember in this news item, information about IPBES is very important. Just remember each and every fact about it. All right. Okay. Now we move on to our next news item, which is D8 summit in Cairo. So Bangladesh has asked Pakistan to settle the issues of 1971 to help Dhaka move forward with its relationship with us, Islamabad, once and for all for the future generations. As you guys all know, Bangladesh before 1971 was part of Pakistan. It was called East Pakistan. Okay. But in 1971, Bangladesh Liberation War happened. India supported Bangladesh and Bangladesh gained independence. It severed from Pakistan and a new country, Bangladesh, was created. Now, there are many issues that are still pending between Pakistan and Bangladesh because at one point of time they were one country and they shared many resources. But once Bangladesh got independent, some of those resources, no decision was taken on some of those resources, how they will be shared. Okay. So Bangladesh wants to settle all these issues so that Bangladesh and Pakistan can move forward in a friendly manner. Now, Bangladesh's chief advisor, Muhammad Yunus, and Pakistan Prime Minister Sharif also talked about revival of SARC. Now, as you all know, SARC is currently suspended because of India-Pakistan rivalry. India-Pakistan relationship hasn't been going on well. It is really in cold waters, right? And that is why SARC is in cold waters, because India and Pakistan are the two most important countries in SARC. But Bangladesh and Pakistan are saying that we need to revive SARC. Now, all these discussions were made on the sidelines of D8 summit. So, what is this D8 summit? Okay, so look, D8 is an organization for economic cooperation. Okay, so it is an economic group. Now, its full form is Developing 8, and it is an organization that leads to economic cooperation between these 8 countries. Now, who are these 8 countries? Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Turkey. All of them almost are Muslim countries, okay, with the exception of Nigeria, which has a mixed population, but most of the people in Nigeria are also Muslims. Okay. Now, this organization, Developing 8, was formed in 1996. Its first summit happened in 1997. Its headquarters are in Istanbul, Turkey. And earlier it was called D8, but now it should be called D9 because in 2024, very recently, Azerbaijan was also included as a member of this organization. All right. So that's all you need to know about D8. But you need to have some information regarding the historical background of Bangladesh and Pakistan, right? So, as I've mentioned before, Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, known as East Pakistan until 71, but became an independent country after the Bangladesh Liberation War. Okay. Now, initially, Pakistan refused to recognize Bangladesh's independence, but it came around after a couple of years. In 1974, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan signed a tripartite agreement in New Delhi, which took care of most of the issues between Bangladesh and Pakistan. Okay. It dealt with repatriation of Pakistan prisoners of war in Indian camps, okay, and the resettlement of stranded populations in the two countries. Whoever wants to reside in Bangladesh can come back from Pakistan. Whoever wants to go to Pakistan can go from Bangladesh, okay, because both these countries were one country at one point of time. Okay, so there might be some people in Bangladesh who want to live in Pakistan. So they were allowed under this agreement to go to Pakistan, and some Pakistanis were allowed to go to Bangladesh. So that was allowed. So issues like these were taken care of by tripartite agreement. Plus, because the Bangladesh Liberation War involved India, Indian Army, and Pakistan, and India comprehensively defeated Pakistan and took many, more than 90,000 Pakistani soldiers as prisoners of war. Now, this tripartite agreement actually talked about release of those prisoners of war. Okay, and plus it also talked about issues between Bangladesh and Pakistan. But despite this agreement, there were still many pending issues between Bangladesh and Pakistan, which Muhammad Yunus is saying to Shahbaz Sharif that we need to resolve them so that future generations can build upon this environment of stability, peace, and friendship. All right, that was the issue. Just remember what D8 summit is. All right, and last, RBI's report on state finances. So, look, every year, RBI comes out with a report where it talks about the financial position of state governments. Okay, as far as central governments are concerned, well, that is there. But for state governments, RBI comes out with its report. This report is known as State Finances. Okay. Now, this report is important because during the pandemic, state finances nosedived. Okay. They were in a really bad position because most of the financial burden of tackling COVID fell on state governments. Okay. They had their spending, their expenditure increased dramatically, but their revenue sources fell because economy was not going on, lockdown was there were no tax collection, so their revenues fell, but expenditure skyrocketed. And that is why their debt situation, their deficit situation really nosedived. Okay. In 2020-21, the combined fiscal deficit of all states rose to 4.1% of GDP, and their debt to GDP ratio rose to 31%. To put things into perspective, central government says that the debt to GDP ratio of all states should be 20% of GDP, and deficit should not be more than 3%. Okay? So this was a problematic statistic. But what has the RBI said in its recent report on state finances? Well, it has given some positive news. Okay? RBI says that state finances have improved. There are many positive signals coming out of state finances. Some of these positive signals are, first of all, states have stuck to the path of fiscal consolidation. Okay. What do you mean by fiscal consolidation? Well, fiscal consolidation means decline in fiscal deficit. Okay. And what is fiscal deficit? Well, states spend a lot of money. Okay. So there is some expenditure. States earn a lot of money also. There is some revenue. Okay. Now, if states are spending 200 rupees, but their revenue is 160 rupees, then 40 rupees would be their deficit. And where would they fulfill that deficit from? Well, they would borrow money to fulfill that expenditure. So when your expenditures are more than your revenue, you run a fiscal deficit. Okay. Now, state finances were really in a bad position. But after lockdown, state governments took steps to reduce their fiscal deficit. And this process of reducing fiscal deficit is known as fiscal consolidation. You remember, at one point of time during lockdown, their fiscal deficit was 4.1% of GDP. Well, RBI in its report says that states have successful in reducing that to 2.9%. Plus, their debt was more than 30%. They have reduced it to 28.5%. So, states have been doing really well as far as fiscal consolidation is concerned. Plus, the expenditure is of two types. Okay. One is capital expenditure, the other is revenue expenditure. Now, revenue expenditure is your day to day expenditure, the money you spend on subsidies, salaries, pensions, and whatnot. Capital expenditure is something that gives you growth in future, right? Capital expenditure is something that is growth boosting, like spending on infrastructure projects, building roads, bridges, and whatnot, right? So capital expenditure is growth boosting expenditure. Revenue expenditure is, well, uh, in long term it is not a beneficial expenditure. Now, RBI says that the state governments have not only been able to reduce their fiscal deficit, they have also increased the share of their capital expenditure within the total expenditure, which is good because that would boost the growth of state governments or state economy in the long term. Okay, so these are encouraging developments. But RBI's report is not only full of good news. RBI has also raised some red flags. RBI's report contains some negative news also with respect to state finances. Okay, so what are these red flags? First of all, state governments are running huge losses when it comes to power sector. You see, most of the power companies in states are government owned, state government owned. And if these power companies are running losses, well, state governments are running losses. The losses of power distribution companies stood at staggering 6.5 lakh crore by 22-23, which is 2.4% of GDP. Now, this is very important. If this continues to be the case, all the improvements made by state governments in the past couple of years would vanish. So, states should take care of this. RBI says that. Then, in recent times, state governments have increased their subsidies. Now, as I've mentioned before, expenditure is of two type: capital and revenue. Now, revenue expenditure is not good, capital is good because it boosts growth in future. Now, subsidies is revenue expenditure. Okay. And this would really widen your fiscal deficit. It would increase your fiscal deficit and no growth would come out of it in future. Now, RBI says that in recent times, expenditure on subsidies has increased. Free electricity, free transport, gas cylinder, cash transfer, loan waivers have increased state government subsidy bill. In fact, as per Axis Bank report, 14 states have income transfer schemes for women with spending of 2 lakh crore. This is 0.6% of GDP. So state governments are increasing their expenditure burden because of subsidies. What they should do is, RBI says, they should increase their expenditure, but that expenditure should come on the capital side. Plus, as far as debt is concerned, state governments have some contingent liabilities also. Now, what do you mean by contingent liabilities? Contingent liabilities are those liabilities that are not liabilities until a condition is fulfilled. Okay, so they are based upon a condition. Look, let's suppose UP raises a debt of 1 lakh crore. Okay, so this 1 lakh crore will become a liability of UP government. Okay, this is the debt. Debt is a liability. Okay, now the thing is, let's suppose UP government doesn't raise 1 lakh crore of debt. What UP government does is, UP government tells its banks to loan 1 lakh crore to its farmers. Okay, so UP government comes out with a scheme in which farmers can take loans from banks up to a limit of 1 lakh crore, total limit of 1 lakh crore. Okay, now banks are not ready to give that much amount of debt or credit to farmers. So what UP does is, UP says that we are giving you credit guarantee. What do you mean by credit guarantee? In case the farmers are unable to pay back these loans, we will pay back these loans on behalf of farmers. Okay, so in a sense, this 1 lakh crore of debt is on farmers, not UP government. Okay, so it is not the liability of UP government, it is the liability of farmers. But the thing is that UP government provides credit guarantee on these loans. So in case farmers are unable to pay back these loans, then these loans would become the liability of UP government because UP government has taken credit guarantee. Now, this is a classic case of contingent liability. Contingent means condition, conditional liability, which means it is not the liability of UP government, but it will become a liability of UP government if this condition is fulfilled. And what is that condition? That farmers are unable to pay back their debt. So, if this condition of farmers being unable to pay their debt holds true, then this would become a liability. Otherwise, it won't be a liability, right? This is contingent liabilities, and contingent liabilities have also increased. This is what RBI's report finds out. Okay, so there are some good news, but there are some red flags as well. All right, and with that, we conclude today's session. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and I'm sure it value to your preparation, but it would add more value if you spend another 20 minutes revising this lecture, because revision really helps you to remember these current affairs for longer periods of time. All right. On that note, I'll be signing off. Thank you so much.